First, I'm really excited to be here. I, my plan was to be here in person, obviously, and then I had to be in two places at the same time. But again, that's one of the beauty about community, and having been here in Their First Lagos is really, really great. I plan to make this section a little bit interactive. So again, I'm going to be asking questions as much as just to give, audience feedback. The title of my talk is obviously Decentralization is in open source. But before I go into whatever this means, how many of you here are in Web3? Raise your hand now, raise your hand. When you people were dragging each other on Twitter, you were very loud. How many of you are in Web3? Great, cool. What about if you identify as a Web2 developer? Web2? Okay. What about being a community manager in Web3? No community managers again. What about Web2? No community manager. Okay. In this room, how much developer do we have in this room? Full stack HTML developer. You can. Okay, that's a very decent amount. Okay. Anyways, like I said, the focus of this talk is to kind of reduce that friction that has to do with, do I do Web 2 or do I do Web 3? Especially now that you've been hearing the word open source. A lot of people keep saying, oh, how do I contribute to open source as a Web 2 developer? Or some people are like, oh, I'm trying to go into Web 3. I'm trying to build on Ethereum. I'm trying to build in different chain. But how do I do it in an open source way? So now the focus of this talk isn't necessarily around you contributing to open source, but it's all about how much of an open source do you need to be able to understand the concept of decentralization? And is decentralization open source or not? And that's kind of one of the arguments that I've been seeing lately. So a little bit about me. I'm the co-founder for the Open Source Community Africa. So if you're familiar with Open Source Festival, that is under the Open Source Community Africa. I'm on the board for the Open Collective organization, which is basically enabling open source maintainers to be able to raise funds. So if you're building a package, you want to raise money, or a company is using your tool, we are basically the organization that does that. And just like what they mentioned earlier, just 2 days ago, I was in Johannesburg having the first ever GitHub event called the Constellation as part of being a GitHub star. So kind of see GitHub star as like the equivalent of being a GDE, a developer's expert. So that's kind of the similarity. And of course, I like to talk about open source all the time, from Twitter Spaces to events like this, to sometimes in my dreams. Who never knows? But yeah. And of course, you can follow me on Twitter at Samson_Goddy, or you can find me on LinkedIn. But before we go, I would like someone in the audience, I don't know if there's mic around, to kind of let this audience know what is decentralization. Does anyone want to? Somebody with a mic? I can see a lady there. In your words, what do you think is decentralization?
In a simple term, decentralization means is not held by someone, by a particular entity, like is owned by everybody.
Anybody else? And that's awesome. Please, can we clap for her, please? There's someone else, someone here? Yeah.
So I would say decentralization is like eliminating...
Sorry, what's your name?
Okay, my name is Temi. So I would say decentralization is like eliminating monopoly.
Okay, that's a very interesting one. Lastly, someone here? There is one person here.
Yeah. Decentralization is the ability to share resources without a centralized unit.
Oh, that's perfect. One more for the lady there, and then I'll switch.
Okay. Okay, so decentralization is the absence of centralization. It allows for autonomy, self-government, basically.
That perfect, amazing. I actually like that word centralized. One of the most important thing, being in tech is having to argue what is centralization and what is decentralization and which is best. And that's, of course, that's one of the things that we're going to be learning here. And again, thank you all for, giving that explanation. But I'm also curious, from what we've been able to hear, it's all about, because the things are decentralized, there is no single point of failure, which is really, really key, especially when you're trying to build in the Web3 space, or the way I like to term it, the next generation of web, because we've heard about Web 5. I'm sure in like a couple years from now, we're going to be hearing Web 6 and the likes. So let's just assume that decentralization here, or DLT, is the next generation of web. But again, I think it's all about that you need to understand that there's no single point of failure, and it's harder, like she said, to be able to censor. So for things like Twitter, your social media apps that are so easy to regulate because it is centralized by an entity. But what about open source? What is open source? Can someone tell us, in their definition, what is open source? Don't worry. What do you think open source is? There's someone there?
I'll say open source is like a resource open for anybody to manipulate or use to how they want it to be, then now like post it back on GitHub for others to see and like also replicate or even innovate on it. So it's not owned by a single organization, but like a group of people.
Awesome. Can we clap for him, please? There's someone at the back. There's a lady. Is it okay? Yeah.
Okay. Open source like a platform, like a place where everyone comes together to contribute their own share or like their own idea of a particular general data or information. Like they come to share, to give what's they mean, but by that particular concept or idea.
Amazing. Is there anybody else? There's someone here, yeah? Sorry. Someone here. Now, the reason why I'm doing this is because this slide or this talk is supposed to be very controversial. So I'm trying to make sure that we see both sides of the debate. So.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jimmy Salu. Oga Samson, it's so good to see you again. So open source to me is like a resource that is publicly accessible.
Publicly accessible. There's someone, yeah. Keyword, publicly accessible.
Okay, my name is Exal. What I understand by open source is it could be a product, mostly software, that some groups of developers, might not really be a group of developers, might actually be an individual that pushed a product out there without requiring people to pay to use it. So that's actually what open source means. And then other developers might do out of interest. They want to improve the functionalities and the features on that particular product, and then they contribute to it without getting paid. So that's what I understand by open source.
Okay, before we go with other people, I'm very curious. Someone that is in Web3, can you please define open source to the audience that you're in Web3? I'm curious. Sorry, could you tell us your name and what you do in Web3, and then you can define it, yeah.
Okay. My name is Ibrahim Bello, and I'm actually a newbie. I'm just diving into the Web3, so I'm coming from Web2.
Same here. I'm a newbie. We're not school, yeah, sorry.
So actually, my definition, like what I understand about open source is that it's actually a kind of software. For example, a software that allows people to have access to the source code. It allows people to use and as well as contribute to the software You know, like other softwares are all basically kept for the company. So like you have access to that particular source code and you can modify it, you can contribute to it. That's basically what it is. I don't know if I'm kind of...
Yeah, that's good. Please, can we clap for him, please? Now, before I go to the next slide, do we all think that because you're building a decentralized app, that automatically means that you're doing open source? If you are in the opinion, please raise up your hand. Don't worry, just raise your hand. Trust me, they're going to give you your food. Trust me. Raise your hand. Should I repeat the question? Now, we just defined, in one hand, there's decentralization, right? And in the other hand, there's open source. Now, if you're in Web3, you're building a decentralized app, does that automatically mean that you're doing open source based on the definition? There's a lady there. Yeah, there's a lady at the back, yeah.
So, if you are building a app, right, it's not open source. It's open source if it's a community-based project. So when I mean community-based project, like you are trying to create a chain site, a parachain or something like that, and you want people to, make the project more scalable, like in terms of contributing, adding more nodes to the sidechain. But if you are building a app that you just want people to come and use...
Please, what's DApp? So for people that's hearing the term for the first time, yeah.
So that means a decentralized application. So Web3 applications are called DApps. That's decentralized application.
Okay, that's perfect. Please. One more person, then I continue. One more person. Okay. I see one hand there, so we can do him and then that last person. Yeah.
Okay, great stuff. Great. So my name is Olabode Lawal Shidebe. I'm in open source myself. And I just want to say that decentralization, unlike open source, is something that has a bit of open source in it, optionally. I mean, open source sort of connotes something. It connotes trust, because the source code and everything that powers a certain product or an application is live for everybody to see, right? And you know what runs in there. So if you're doing a decentralization thingy, like you're decentralizing an app, if you say the app itself is open sourced again, it's sort of like an extra credit on top of decentralizing the app, right? So there can be a dApp that is not exactly open sourced, and there can be a dApp that is open source. So, exactly.
That's perfect. I feel like I can just end my talk and we go home. But of course, we're still arguing.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Murtado. I decentralized.
Sorry, can you tell us what you do, please?
Okay, so I'm a smart contract developer.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So a decentralized app can be identified as open source in the sense that, as he said, the source code is available for everyone to see. So you can see the source code and see everything that this developer has written to build this application. But it's not open source in the sense that you cannot contribute to it, because one of the key factors of decentralization is the immutability of the chain. Once the application has been deployed, it cannot be changed. That is why it is trust minimized. You trust it that what this person has done, I have seen it, it cannot go back behind doors and change it. So it is not open source because other people cannot contribute to that project. It is what the developer has built that it's always going to be. Thank you very much.
That's amazing. That's perfect. Can we please clap for him, please? Now, of course, there's been a really amazing definition of what open source is. But again, it's all about transparency, trust, it encourages teamwork, and innovation. In fact, one of the things that you need to understand when it comes to remote work, in fact, the reason you can do remote work is thanks to the open source culture. Because, again, to be able to contribute code, whether you're a designer or you're a community manager or you're a tester. I know there was a talk about security late. Whether you're doing cybersecurity, it's all about that ability that people trust you to be able to contribute to the code base. And of course, there are examples of open source. There's the Linux kernel. There's now the most, again, I'm not shading JavaScript people, but now the most, again, not shading JavaScript people, now the most popular language on GitHub, Python. I know there's an argument about, and they took TypeScript away from JS, blah, blah. It's giving Manchester United fans. But anyways, not to go into football. Anyways, the point here is there's a lot of tools that have been open source by default, like Python, like the Linux kernel. The reason why there's Linux kernel today, and you have things like Android, which is obviously, developed by Google. There've been a lot of deployments because these tools has always been open source. And now that we're going into things like the Web3, the next generation of web, basically building a lot of things, there've always been this tension around, is Web3 really open source? There was a smart contract, the last person that spoke identified as a smart contract developer. I've always been curious, why are people always using, why is Solidity the default language to write smart contracts? Why not things like Python? Why, again, these are the challenges I've been asking. As a very curious person, in the last 1 year, I have the opportunity to be working for a company as an open source program manager to kind of like take the entire code base. So imagine, okay, I can obviously call the company. Hedera basically started, and the reason why this talk is really critical is because Hedera recently, or previously rather, started to build something. Basically, they saw what the blockchain is. Everyone knows what blockchain is. They're like, oh, we want to build the next generation of the blockchain. And they were like, okay, let's invent something called the hash graph, which is basically supposed to be way faster, safer, and then, and cheap. Now, the reason why that's important is because, if you're building an app, or again, if you're building a dApp and you're trying to deploy it, especially in the Ethereum side of things, you start looking at a lot of gas fees. Am I wrong? Exactly. So these are the things that they were really, really interested in because they wanted to build something that enterprise would use. Then, of course, to be able to do that, they started seeing them as, oh, they are not open enough, they're not decentralized enough. And to be fair, that was true because they started building a decentralized platform, but the best way they were able to interact with the community was through something called open access. So basically, you can see the code on GitHub, but you can't do anything about it. So that's why sometimes I always tell people, just because you can see a code on GitHub doesn't necessarily mean that code is open source. It has to have a license that says, hey, you can do 1, 2, 3, guided by the license. Exactly, like one of the things, again, when it comes to common misconception, all open source software is decentralized. Yes, I love GitHub, right? Of course, I represent GitHub. But GitHub is a single entity that hosts over millions of open source projects. But that doesn't mean that GitHub itself is decentralized, right? It's a centralized platform. But again, people trust the platform to say, hey, we want to be able to host our code base here. Even lots of the decentralized community have obviously been building on GitHub, but GitHub, in this case, is a centralized platform. And then, of course, there's a conversation of like decentralized versus open source. In fact, the first time I came across the NFT wave a couple years ago, I was like, oh, okay, this is interesting. And then I started seeing some backlash from the Web2 developers. They'd be like, this thing is a sham, it's like crazy, you know. There were a lot of confusion because people really didn't know what to do with these things. Again, it was because they were trying to judge it from like, is this really a community-led, community effort build? Now, like I said, in one hand, I don't know which hand, okay. In one hand, you focus on who controls the system. In the other hand, you focus on how the software is built. There's decision making, then it's obviously open for people to be able to view, and not just view. You know, in computing, there's something called read-only, right? Of course, anybody can read, but readable, but also modifiable. These two things are very important, especially when you want to build a successful project, or in this case, an application. Now, there's a real-world example. Like I said, in the last 1 year, I've been consulting for Hedera, basically enabling them to figure out what is the best way to do something that feels like the CNCF, basically the Cloud Native Foundation, for people to understand Kubernetes here. You know, the story was that Google was building something internally, and then it decided to donate the Kubernetes code to the Linux Foundation, and then they created something called the CNCF as a community-led effort to foster the community growth and the code growth of Kubernetes. And today it's one of the largest community. In fact, this same week there was KubeCon. And they were like, oh, we want to do something similar to that. And then hence, the Linux Foundation launched something called the Linux Foundation Decentralized Trust. So basically, it is like your CNCF, but on anything that is decentralized. So like I said, it is an initiative from the Linux Foundation. Of course, Linux Foundation is the biggest home to open source when it comes to projects, from security to cloud to computing, even to energy. That's how big they are. And they always tend to want to expand as time goes on. So yes, so I was working with the Linux Foundation to figure out what is the way for a layer 1 blockchain to say we are actually an open source project, or we're actually an open source blockchain, or whatever that thing means. It was really, really interesting, and that's what I'm going to be talking a bit. So like I said, I was working with the Linux Foundation, of course, with my colleagues for the last 1 year, and then we decided to launch something called Hyro. Hyro is basically the entire Hedera core network donated to the Linux Foundation. So imagine MoneyPoint, for example, take their entire code base and say, oh, we are donating it to an open source organization because we want people to build things. That was really, really interesting. And that's something that we were working on. And because we were trying to figure out what is the best way to bridge that gap. I'm not really going to be talking much about Hedera. You can go and Google and discuss and see things. But I'm just mostly going to be focusing on Hyro. So Hyro became a project like the Kubernetes that you know, but represents a code base of an entire organization. And the reason why that was important was because they wanted people to see that, in fact, the best innovation from your programming language to the developers tool you use is because it's always been in a vendor-neutral organization. So if you're thinking about like Python, you will not think about Google, for example. You think about the Python Software Foundation, because the Python Software Foundation is a foundation that focuses to make sure that the Python code base and the community efforts is being maintained from a neutral point of view. And that was really, really key. Just like what I explained. The focus was to make sure that there's no single entity that would monopolize the code base, even including the people that donated it, which is in this case, Hedera, because they believe that their consensus in this case is powerful enough that anyone can adopt, and they want people to take it and do whatever they want to do with it, given that concept of collaboration. Now, the reason why that is key is because it empowers open innovation. Now, imagine Android decided to take the same process as iOS. Now, I'm not taking a shade at Apple, but imagine that. You wouldn't have the likes of Techno, Infinix, or the budget low-end phones. Basically, mobile computing would be so expensive for people to use because, again, it's being controlled by a single entity. But what happened? It became an open source platform, so companies can decide to take whatever they want to do with Android, build on top of it, and of course, there's now different versions of Android. From the Samsung side, you have something like One UI. I know there's things like Oxygen OS, and the likes. And the reason why that was important was because Google chose to keep the code base open. That is one of the most important things that folks in Web3 should understand. Again, like I said, and based on the definitions you've been hearing from the audience, they are private blockchains in this case. Like I said, I work for a company that has been defined as an enterprise blockchain. And of course, the code base would always stay within the organization. But then in the open source side of things, you always need to understand that, again, the code is open, but the code is also decentralized, which is really, really critical. Now, why is this confusion really, really bad? And the reason why I'm saying this is because 3 weeks ago, I was in, I don't know, how many of you here know the It's Global Hackathon? Awesome, great, okay. I was at It Global San Francisco, and I was seeing people hacking, building AI tools on top of blockchain. It was for the first time, that was my first ever Web3 hackathon. I was like, oh, this is really, really great. But then I started understanding that most of this code base are not even open. What happens when someone builds something and he decides to not open source it, and then something happens to the maintainer or the creator? What happens? That idea dies off. There's no projections on how to maintain a code base. And again, this is a challenge, and this was something that I was like, okay. But one interesting thing is, which I asked earlier, is why is Solidity still the default language to deploy a smart contract? Why not the most programming language in the world, Python? These are the questions. Now, from the technical point of view, obviously, I don't have the answer. I'm not even a smart contract person. But it's just to kind of give you an idea of the reason why to be a developer, even in the Web3 space, the reason why it's hard is because the open source ethos are not even available. So it makes it so hard for you to learn. Today, you're learning Python. You're building backend, and then you want to build smart contract, you have to go and learn Solidity. You see? But then if you're doing something in Web 2, and you want to interact with something, you go and use, obviously, some great SDKs, and you take your language of any choice, whether you're writing JavaScript, Python, or Go, and you can do whatever you want to do with it. Yes, some organizations have been creating SDKs to allow people to do some version of dApps. But again, to be able to have that full Web3 experience, you start thinking about, oh, what language should I learn? And maybe that's why in the Web 2 world, there's over 100 million developers on GitHub. But in the Web 3 world, I don't know how many developers you can find. In fact, I think I saw the number from DEF CON saying there's about less than 200 builders in Africa alone. For context, the GitHub universe, there was a data saying that in Nigeria on GitHub, there's 1.2 million developers right now in Nigeria. So basically, every 1,000 person you're meeting, between 5 to 7 person you meet, can actually identify as a developer. That's how powerful it is. And now GitHub is now pushing and say, hey, we want to have 1 billion developers on our platform. So what that means is that we want to increase the number of developers that are in Africa. But again, there are fewer developers in Web3. Those are the kind of things that we need to think about. Again, like I said, what are the problem right now? Expectations when you're working for a company and they say, hey, we want you to do DevRel in Web3. And then sometimes the founders don't have an idea what to do. They're like, oh, you know what? It's open source. You can take whatever I want to take and push it to the community. And then in like 6 months, you're getting fired. You're wondering what's happening. Is because they themselves don't understand what they actually want, especially when it comes to building for the community. Like I said, there are always poor decisions by users and businesses. In fact, I'm not even going to mention names. The first time I wanted to buy crypto, actually, I was like, oh, let me try to see if I can buy a coin. I went to one of the most popular apps. I downloaded the app, and I looked at it. I was like, how do I buy it? And again, it's not like I'm using technology for the first time, but the process was so complicated. You now wonder, like, are they not designers in Web3? You know? Because again, a 5-year-old right now can't even buy simple thing on an app. So those are kind of the things that you think about. How do you make sure that you're building something that a 5-year-old can use? Now, if you go to google.com, the Google search bar, or even using ChatGPT, it's so easy for someone to use because, again, they're thinking about how would the community feel, and that's one of the important things you need to think about. What are the key takeaways and action? Like I said, the main point is that there's decentralization, there's open source. Both are very different, but also can work together, just like what we were doing with Hyro. And for developer, if you need decentralization, you can choose to decide and say, oh, do I need decentralization? Or do I just strictly build my open source project? Or do I do both? And for businesses, if you're building an app or you're building a solution in Web3, you kind of need to understand and communicate how does your project affect developers. So you kind of empower your engineers and your developers advocate to go out there to talk about things that reflect on the business. And of course, for everybody, how do you learn and understand the differences to be able to make informed choices? How, as of today, how many great resources that enable you to build your first dApp? Is there a lot of tutorials right now that say, oh, build your first dApp with Python? So these are kind of the things that you kind of need to reflect, and I want people to go back home and think about both. And again, like I said, you can take photos. If you want to learn more about what we're doing with the Linux Foundation, you can take photos and look that out. Like I said, it's open source, so you can go to hyro.com/contribute. If you want to contribute to an open source DLT platform, you can do that with hyro.org. Or if you want to do anything, I don't know, see the code, modify it, take it, do whatever I want to do, build your own network, you can go to github.com/hyro-ledger. So, questions? Any questions? There's no way I just explained this thing perfectly. It's not even possible. I see there's 2 people here. I was expecting people to come, like, the energy on Twitter is always very different in person. Keyboard warriors versus in-person warriors. What you order versus what you get.
All right. Thank you very much for the presentation.
Yep.
Can you hear me now? All right. Thank you very much for the presentation. My question is based on all you said so far. I'm actually a software engineer, Python developer, actually. So when we were hailing Python, I was hitting this guy that is always fighting me with his JavaScript. So about the Web3 space, I've been hearing a lot about Web3 and, about the less saturation compared to how Web2 is. In fact, one of my friends that moved to South Africa was not really a tech guy, but I thought it was just all of these crypto investments. I've been talking about this Web3, but I'm not really interested because I'm already into web development and AI automation. So, but now I feel like I want to transition into it, but not full interest, right? I still want to get clarity on. I just mentioned one of those things you guys used. So I don't know if there is, because you just shared a GitHub repo, like a guide.
Is it possible to have the link back, please? My slide is gone.
All right. GitHub.com, iRoad dash.
Yeah, so it's Hyro-ledger. So github.com
okay,
slash
ledger.
Hyro-ledger. Yeah.
All right. I'll find that out. So I want to know, what's the difference between Solidity, Rust? Because I hear people talk about if you want to learn Web3, you need to understand Rust, you need to understand
Where is the smart
clarity,
contract person? I want him to answer this question. Can we give
Rust
the mic
is
to...
actually my guy.
Oh, okay, no, I want that interaction to happen. I'm not an expert in Solidity or building a dApp, so I want experts to answer.
Yeah. Sorry, what was the question again?
All right, so thank God you're also a software engineer. So my question is based on your tech stack, the technologies you guys make use of. You know, in software engineering, web development to be precise, we have programming languages, we have frameworks, we also have libraries that you can find online or packages. So I want to get the clarity, I just mentioned clarity. I want to get the distinct understanding of what clarity is, okay, I just learned what dApps mean, like at this place
Decentralized
right
apps,
now.
yeah.
Like, it's actually an app, but a decentralized
app,
application. So is Solidity a framework or is it a programming language on its own?
Okay, so you said something the other time that why do all smart contract developers need to learn Solidity before coding on the blockchain? Yeah, that is not entirely correct because there are different blockchains in the Web3 system, right? There is Ethereum, and there is Stacks, there is Optimism, there is Arbitrum. So all of these blockchains, most of them have different programming languages that you use to write smart contracts on them. I said I'm a smart contract developer. I'm actually a smart contract developer on the Stacks blockchain. And the programming language used on Stacks is Clarity. Yes.
Okay.
So to build on Ethereum, the programming language you're going to need to learn is Solidity. But right now, to help Web2 developers that are transitioning into Web3, I recently learned of a new framework, which is Web3.js, which is just like writing, it helps Web2 developers to feel like you're writing JavaScript code, but you're actually building on the blockchain. So it's just like you're integrating JavaScript into the blockchain.
Is that a wrapper? Would you say that's a wrapper? I'm just curious about the language itself.
Which one?
Like the language you just called now. The
Web3.js. Web3.js.
Yeah,
sorry,
yeah.
it's Web3.js.
Okay.
It's like
Is
JavaScript.
Okay, full native,
Yes,
not
it's
a wrapper.
Like, yeah. It's just like.
So the reason I asked this question is, when I look at some SDKs like Python, like for example in Hedera, there's a Python SDK, but then you need Java on the back end because Python is talking to Java to be able to do dApps.
Yeah, okay.
So that's why I want that clarity.
The way Web3.js works is there are some APIs that are already available that can help you make connection to the Ethereum blockchain. So it works on all EVMs, all Ethereum compatible machines.
EVMs, yeah.
Yes. So it works on all EVMs. So it allows you to access, like you can a JavaScript code that can get somebody's wallet's balance, and you can write a JavaScript code that you can use to transfer some tokens from one wallet to another or do several other stuff. So you can just basically write JavaScript code, but you are interacting with the blockchain. So there are different stuff.
So I have a question for you. Why, again, the reason I said Solidity is because it's the most popular language
it is.
in Web3.
Yeah.
Of course, I know there are other ones. But why Solidity? Why not Rust? Why not other languages? Again, you don't have, if there's no perfect answer, again, this is something I'm trying to understand.
Yeah.
Why choose to why reinvent the wheel?
Okay, Solidity is kind of built for building on Ethereum. So it's like, we built this programming language for you to do this. So I cannot I cannot answer the question of why did they choose to build Solidity, because definitely I'm not part of the core developers that designed that programming language. I don't know why, but I just know it is developed to build smart contracts on Ethereum. The same way Clarity was developed for us to build smart contracts on Stacks blockchain.
Okay, so based on that, again, this is looking at the pros and cons. If decentralization is all about giving everyone control, why use a language that is not popularly known?
I think we are, as developers, there's one thing everybody should understand is that the industry is evolving fast, and as a developer, you need to be flexible. So we can't all write Python, and we can't all write JavaScript, right? So if there's something you're interested in, and there's a programming language that you need to learn, I feel like we shouldn't have a problem learning it. I was having a conversation with someone today, and I said, as a software developer, if you are a full software developer, it's going to be very easy for you to pick up any programming language. I mean, I write Clarity, I know a little bit of Solidity, and it took me barely 2 weeks to get a grasp of Solidity. So it's very, very easy. Just learn the syntax of how the things works in this programming language, and you're good to go.
There's someone at the back, yeah. Someone at the back there. Anyways, we should definitely clap for him. That's a lot of explanation. Yeah.
I think I was just going to go from your question again.
Okay.
If you already have a Python or Rust that can be used across various blockchains, why do you need that vendor lock-in?
You know
Why
what?
do you need?
You know what? Let me quickly answer that question, and I want him back. Now, again, like I said, I don't identify, I know I have some minutes. I don't identify as a Web3 developer. I'm not an expert, so I cannot speak on best practices. That's why I'm referring to you.
Okay.
But then, when I started, the first time I wrote my first line of code, there's someone talking. There's someone with a mic. Okay. The first time I wrote a code was building on Linux. I was building a desktop application as an 8-year-old kid on Linux. Now, the reason that was important was because there was obviously C, C++, all those OG language that if you're learning object-oriented programming, you'd be like, you know what, computer science is not for me. There's a lot of complex things to learn. But imagine a 5-year-old or an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old picking C to write an app. Do you think that gives room for the kid to grow? Now, of course, because it's open source, the community was like, okay, you know what? Let's keep whatever culture, the 10x developer, people like Linus himself and the likes are building whatever they are building. But let's work with the community and figure out languages that are easily readable and language that people can access. Hence why you have this multiple programming language. And guess what? People started building on Linux. Now, like I said, there are over 100 million developers on GitHub identified as Web 2. I don't think there's even 2% of that number in Web 3. People you can buy crypto or whatever, but how many people actually build? Hence the question. Anyways, I just see that my time is up. We can argue these things later on. But again, thank you very much for having me. Thank you very much, Jeffers, folks. Thank you very much.
All right, let's have it once more for Samson Goddy.